So good afternoon, good evening, good morning for those who are on the west coast of the US, and a very late good evening, I guess, for those who are joining us from Asia. It's wonderful to have you all here. So this is the Sixth Leap lecture. I'll ask Lisa soon to introduce the speaker, and then there will be a short time afterwards for some questions and some reflections. So Lisa, over to you.
I'm Lisa. I'm a PhD student with LEAP here in Stellenbosch. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dozy, our speaker for the evening. So Dozy earned his PhD in economics at the University of Western Ontario in 2013. He then joined Dalhousie University, where he is currently an associate professor at the economics department. And he was also recently involved as a research associate at the Center for the Study of Economics of Africa, which is based in Nigeria. Dozy is interested in many research topics, but his recent work focuses on missionary activity and economic development in Africa. We know that historic events can have long-term impacts on economic development, and the work of the Christian missionaries in Africa was an important historical event which has had an enduring effect on African religion and cultural practices, but it's also had persistent effects that go beyond this. For example, in order to spread the Christian faith and attract converts, missions opened schools and were heavily involved in the dissemination of education. And so missionary activity in Africa has provided us with an experiment to examine how external interventions can have persistent impacts on how societies develop. It's an area of research that continues to grow and provide interesting insights on how these interventions lead to various outcomes relating to wealth, education, and even trust. And so Dozy, welcome, and we look forward to listening to your presentation.
All right, thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for joining today. So I'll be speaking today on just my perspectives on Christian missions and African social. The title should appropriately be African social change, because development implies some positive trajectory. But I think if it was social change, it will leave room for positive change and possibly negative changes. But anyway, I'll be speaking on colonial era Christian missions and social change in African societies. In terms of the outline, I'll provide a brief introduction and overview of recent work in this area. So I'm not going to. I'll state it right now. I'm not going to cover every possible study in this field. So if I don't cite yours, I apologize in advance. But I'll try to cover as much as possible, and then discuss some issues that I've seen emerging in the literature, and provide my perspective on those issues, and then use some recent study or some recent results from research work I've been involved in to back up my perspectives, and then close with some implications and what I see are potential ways forward. And my perspective here will be from the perspective of new economic history, or maybe I guess you might call it cliometrics or econometric history. And this is not to take away from the fact that other historians have been studying these issues for much longer. Okay, there are studies from the 50s, 40s, 60s, and so on. So my perspective is from new economic history, and there has been revived interest in the long-term effects of colonial era Christian missions on African social change. Okay, the paper by Michelopoulos and Papayano it's a survey paper, and it covers some of those results and studies, and the studies cover different areas like education, schooling, health beliefs, okay, and attitudes, and social mobility. So social mobility here basically means that trying to study how how missions have impacted the probability that Africans are better off than their parents or their grandparents. So that's kind of the and missions did this through various ways. They built schools to attract new converts. Okay, they built healthcare centers to deliver healthcare to local communities, and they invested quite a bit in human capital. So that's education and healthcare. But then beyond that, missions also contributed to what you might call social change or institutional change. So this will include things like marriage institutions, okay, polygamy and then trade and commerce. In Ghana, for example, the mission station there was instrumental in introducing, at least in one version of the history, the missions, the basal missions were partly responsible for the introduction of cocoa to Ghana. And cocoa was an important crop in colonial Ghana and continues to be an important crop. All right. So, one point I would like to make is that in all of these areas, our Africans played important roles. So, I mean, the activity of missions in Africa is somewhat an external intervention, but in many ways it was also driven by Africans themselves, okay, as missionaries, okay, and also as people who contributed to building these mission stations, contributed to attracting missions. There's substantial evidence of Africans writing letters, okay, to invite missions to their communities and contributing, church contributions, building churches, building schools, funding teachers and whatnot. And I think at least in the literature so far, okay, and I make the same mistake as well. And in the literature, when colonial era Christian missions are discussed, they're often classified as colonial investments. Okay, in some cases that's true. Okay, the colonial government funded these missions, but in many cases, these missions were independently funded by. Sometimes they relied on contributions from the home mission. Okay, but in other cases, they were funded locally by local congregations. So in many ways, in some cases, it's a colonial investment. In other cases, it's not. It was basically communities investing in themselves. So this is something I would like to kind of clear up at the start. It's in both the supply of mission stations and demanding missions. There's clear African agency involved, and this area is relatively understudied. I mean, there's a recent paper on this looking at the expansion of education in Ghana and looking at roles Ghanaians played in expanding schooling. Okay. And so I'll get into. So a number of studies have studied the long-run persistence of missionary activities. Education is a big area, okay, because why, as has been mentioned at least 2 or 3 times already today, missions invested heavily in schooling. Okay, it was basically the number one way, okay, they attracted converts, okay, and okay, schooling and health care as well. In many ex-British colonies, okay, missions provided basically over more than 90% of all schools were mission schools. Okay, so this is probably why most studies on missions focus on schooling and education. So the first study looked at ex-French colonies, okay, and there's Nigeria, there's the Cape Colony in South Africa, and then Wachacon and co-authors looked at missions in Benin. So West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, we kind of find a strong correlation between the presence of missionary stations and education attainment in the present. And another area that has been studied is the possible persistent effect of missions in healthcare. Okay, so the result on health outcomes are mixed. Okay, the one reason provided for this is in some Christian missions provided health healthcare, okay. But then on the other hand, there were some other changes that Christian missions brought, okay, that might not have been health promoting, so to speak. So things like alcoholism is one, and then alcoholism, maybe people moving to urban areas and the types of sexual activities they would have engaged in, okay, and so on and so forth. So the results on health outcomes are not as at least in the correlation there is not as clear cut as what you might find for education or schooling, and then missions also had an impact on attitudes and beliefs. Okay, so this is we have a study in basically showing that historical exposure to Christian missions is correlated with lower levels of interpersonal trust today. So this is trust in relatives and trust in individuals. And I try to link this to changes, okay, in the traditional ways of or pre-mission ways of doing things, okay. And then Kaje and Reda look at the impact of missions on general trust, okay, and engage, and I guess civic and engagement, and they find positive effects there. And same thing with in Benin, they find that exposure to missions is linked with what I call more risk taking, okay, and more risk taking and increased demand for social mobility, so to speak. And of course, the biggest impact of missions is in the fact that about half of Africans today are Christian, okay, and it's slightly due to the impact of missions, okay. So I think that's kind of we talk about education and whatnot, but the kind of clearest impact is in religion, and so that's in Nathan Nunn's work, and then we also see the impact of missions in social mobility. So again, at least these studies have found that in areas with missions today, okay, people are more likely to be better off than their parents, okay. So the current generation are more likely to be better off in terms of educational attainment, and also in terms of wealth or household income, okay. They're more likely to be better off than their parents. So the study by Whitman and again is in Benin, and then the other studies basically covers most of Africa. So I think I'm trying to paint a broad picture of the type of areas that missions have had an impact, okay, from human capital to social change. But while there have been, so these studies I've cited are not I think I have maybe 15 studies, and you can multiply that by 3 to get to the whole set or more. So I've not cited everything, but even then, I still feel that the transformations, okay, in terms of in society brought by Christian missions are still relatively understudied, okay. They're understudied in the sense that, so in many African societies, okay, religion, okay, and law and tradition and beliefs are all tied up. So at least in traditional societies, and I've not seen, okay, I've not seen conclusion. I think the broader implications of religious change, okay, for traditional law or indigenous law and indigenous institutions, these broader implications, okay, have not really been completely studied in the literature. I think the study by Fensky looks at polygamy, okay, and again they find indeed that in mission locations, okay, there's a decrease in polygamy. Okay, so which is which you might tell me like a change in marriage institutions, but again in while missions were active, okay, this issue about polygamy was a very contentious one. Okay, it led to lots of social problems and forced the forced many Africans to form new churches. So they broke away from the home mission and found their own churches where polygamy could be practiced, I guess, because I guess so that's kind of but then the implications of these changes, of these conflicts, not war per se, but social conflicts, have not really been completely studied. And I've highlighted two issues I'll discuss for the rest of this talk. In terms of there's still a lot to be said about the mechanisms of mechanisms in the sense that how is it that missions that were established in 1890, 1820, 1955, still have persistent impact on education or on education today. What is driving this change? Is it primarily driven by supply? Or is there some selection? Or is it the case that basically missions went to places where people were more likely to want education? So is it kind of persist? So there are different stories we can tell, but the mechanisms are still not well understood. So in some cases, I think in the case of South Africa, at least in the Cape Colonies in South Africa, there is evidence that some of the long-term effects are driven by selection. So people who are more likely to value education move to the mission locations. But this is probably not the case everywhere else, because in many places you couldn't just move your whole family or to the mission station. It just wasn't that. The mission station basically belonged to the community, and so it would have been odd for outsiders that wanted education to move to the station. And so so there's more to be said there. And then there's the issue of identification. So in plain words, this basically means, how do we know we are capturing the impact of missions and not all the colonial investments? So it's definitely possible that, for example, we look at a place like Accra, Ghana. It's developed today, and there was a mission station there, but that does not necessarily mean that the reason why Accra is developed is because of the mission station. It could have been. It's definitely possible that Accra is a coastal. Is close to the coast, which means that it would have been more advanced today, regardless of the presence of mission stations. But obviously, we could be capturing correlations and not causation. And then as I alluded to earlier, there are also possible heterogeneous effects of missions. It's possible that missions did not have the same impact, the same trajectories everywhere else. So for example, in a study by Becker, they show that in areas where polygamy was more likely to be accepted, the impact of missions, the impact is somewhat smaller, or the impacts are smaller because people were more likely to resist missions. And then in ongoing work with some co-authors in Nigeria, we look at the impact of missions in Muslim areas, the impact of missions in areas that were connected to trade, the impact of missions in places that were more likely to be that were more isolated. So and then we also look at the impact of missions in societies that are decentralized, and societies that are more centralized. To basically try to understand. Basically, the idea behind looking at heterogeneity is also to inform, why exactly is the impact of missions? Why exactly are these impacts persistent? And then there's also, I guess I've not seen a lot on the places where missionaries went, and did not succeed. So they could have gone to some places and then shut down after 5 years. What are the long-term implications, if any. Okay, I think this is this is an interesting area to explore. But for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on mechanisms and identification, and then provide my perspective on those on those issues. Okay, so this is kind of probably that. Okay. So in terms of identification, the main issue I would like to address is it the case that the effects being found in the literature, okay, especially I'll focus on schooling, okay, is it due to missions, or is it simply the fact that missions were more likely to be correlated or to be located in places where schools would have been built or would have been established, okay, regardless, okay? So that's one question. On the issue of mechanisms, okay, I'll try to answer these types of questions. So what is important, okay, is it the supply of mission schools, okay? Is it the case that okay, is it the supply of mission schools, okay, or is it the fact that people in an area, okay, were more likely to demand schooling, okay, and then basically if they're more likely to demand schooling, they're more likely to attract missions, and then basically what we're saying in terms of long-run development is not due to missions per se, but is due to high demand for schooling in that area. And I think to address this issue, it's important to separate the demand for education from the demand for missionary education, because I mean, I say this because I've read quite some works that try to argue, for example, in many Muslim areas in West Africa, that basically that the demand that mission, basically, I think, how do I say this? That missions didn't go to those places, okay, because they did not want education. But in many cases, what we find is that they did not want missionary schooling, okay, but they were open to basically to schooling, to education provided by the government, okay. I mean, this was definitely the case in northern Nigeria and northern Ghana. They clearly did not want Christian education, okay, so to say, obviously because they're Muslims, but then they were open to education that was more that was tailored to their beliefs. And what I'll argue is that the failure of the colonial government, okay, to provide, basically the failure of the colonial government to provide education that did not, or to provide substantial education that did not rely on Christian missions, okay, is partly responsible for what you might say for spatial inequities in education, at least in Nigeria and other ex-British colonies in West Africa. Okay, and so just to clarify my thinking, okay, my reading is that I think in this literature, at least, it wouldn't be excessively, it wouldn't be very helpful to separate demand from supply, okay, because what is most likely the case is that it's a dynamic or long-run process, okay. So demand and supply will play roles in, or will be important, okay. And in fact, the study from Benin, in Wachon et al., basically find that what happens is that there's at least the story there is that there's an initial supply of missions, but then this initial supply, okay, boosted aspirations, okay, as aspirations, basically it boosted the demand for more schooling, okay, which attracted more missions and more education. So it's possible that demand can induce supply, okay, which leads to these persistent effects. And it's also possible that supply can, so basically there's initial supply, okay, that then people say that education is useful and valuable, which boosts further demand and then leads to persistent. So I think the question to be more clear about what I'm trying to argue about, or what I'm trying to say, is that what I'm trying to say is what I'm trying to argue about is what is like, what will be the first mover? Okay, what is the initial? What can we say is initially, if it's even possible to answer this kind of question, but what is initially responsible, okay, for the pattern of educational attainment and colonial and missions in the colonial era that we observe today? Okay, is it was the initial supply, okay, important, or was it the initial demand? Okay, that's kind of the main question, because beyond that, okay, demand and supply play complex roles. Okay, so my thesis is not a new one. Okay, it's, you can find it in Frank Kima's study in 2012. Okay, discussing differences between British and French colonies, and then you can find it in the recent study in Ghana. Basically, my thesis is that once supply, basically I'm trying to say that initial supply was critical. Okay, initial access to schooling infrastructure was critical. But once the infrastructure or once supply side constraints were eliminated, okay, then demand, okay, the demand kind of took over from there. Okay, so the study from Wachakon in Benin find the same. Okay, so it's in a sense, I'm not bringing a new thesis, okay, but what I'll do is to provide some evidence to further back this up, okay. That in initial access, okay, played a very critical role, okay, or put another way, places that did not have initial access, okay, continue to kind of struggle today. So I think I'll jump right to it. So some just qualitative this discussion, okay. So one reason why I believe, or I'm arguing, that the initial demand was not important is that if you look at places where Christian missions were most effective 150 years later, 200 years later, okay, the initial success was extremely slow and uneven. Okay, so in Eastern Nigeria, for example, okay, so Eastern Nigeria is basically 99% Christian today. Okay, there are lots of missions in the area. From the map I'll show you. But you find that in Eastern Nigeria, some missions, okay, in prime locations, okay, for 30 years, okay, they only had congregations of, I don't know, 50. Okay, so basically the initial success was very limited. Okay, so this was very, very slow work. Okay, and so if, I guess what I'm trying to say, if demand was high when missions arrived, okay, we would not have seen slow progress. It would have been rapid progress. So in the first schools, or basically success in the earliest Christian missions was very, very slow. Okay, this was very tedious work. So Eastern Nigeria, Western Nigeria, from Kima finds the same in Uganda. So and then when you also look at who attended these early mission schools, okay, you find at least in this context where basically people did not know what to expect from missions and Western education, you find that it was so in many cases you find sons of or children of ex-slaves, okay, that try to or people that were generally in the lower classes of society. Okay, so this is not consistent with missions going to places where demand was already very high. Okay, at least for the earliest missions. Okay, and so I think one error we make in this literature is to equate the fact that missions were successful 150 years later with the fact that they were successful initially. Okay, so I think I'm guessing. So we need better data, okay, in a sense to demonstrate, okay, basically to look at the age of the mission and attendance and whatnot to really understand how strong the initial demand was. Okay, so anyway, so that's one qualitative evidence. A second qualitative evidence is that the absence of missions, the fact that we don't see missions in some places does not necessarily reflect, okay, a lack of demand for schooling. Okay, it could simply be that the people themselves did not want schooling provided by Christian missions. Okay, so that's one. Okay, a second reason could be due to colonial policy. Okay, in northern Ghana and northern Nigeria, there was basically a policy to restrict Christian missions from lots, okay, not all, from many places governed by Muslim rulers. Okay, so I'll explain this a bit more. I think I might just explain it here. The quick explanation is the British liked what they found on the ground in terms of how these Muslim locations were managed. Okay, they were effective in collecting taxes. Okay, and relatively well run. Okay, so the solution to preserve that and reduce the cost of governance was basically to say, okay, we don't want to interfere with their religion and their beliefs. Okay, and of course this makes sense because the power of these rulers, okay, also depended on the followers or the people being Muslim. Okay, so in order to preserve their power and their way of life, and I think it's mostly about in order to preserve high rates of tax collection, okay, we need to restrict, okay, Christian missions from these places. Okay, so in a sense, it was an external policy and not due to a lack of demand for education. Okay, within these areas. And then one last comment I would like to make in terms of missions going to the best places, okay, is that this argument ignores internal mobility. Okay, so missions don't have to be successful by only going to the best places. Okay, it's possible. In fact, this is what we're finding from our field work in Nigeria, and what Wanchekam finds in Benin as well. When missions go to what you might call when they go to the not so good places where there's really not much going on in terms of trade or commerce or a modern economy. Okay, people go to school because it enables them, or people go because it enables them to live. Okay, it enables them to migrate. And again, I think they did this is an underexplored area in the literature. Okay, so in the sense of what is the effect of missions on the probability to leave your local community or your local area, because that's one way. Okay, that's one way missions might have an impact. In fact, during our fieldwork in Nigeria, when we go to some to remote communities that hosted the first mission schools in an area, what you find is that the place itself is not developed, okay, but the people are highly educated, okay, and then when you ask, they basically say, yes, we go to school and then we go to the big city to work. All right, so I think we can look at the impact on locations, okay, but then we can also trace out the impacts, okay, on people, okay, on people. So, okay, so that's kind of and then I think at least, okay, so far I've not really seen much evidence, okay, that in places where missions did not go, okay, that the government or some other person, okay, or some other institution, okay, filled education gaps, okay, and at least not at the scale, okay, at which missions did, okay. In northern Nigeria and in northern Ghana, the government decided to take over the provision of schools in places where missions did not go, okay? But then these schools were largely located in the primary cities, okay, which meant that lots of places in these areas had no access to education, okay, unless they were able to move to the primary cities. So I'll basically present some results from recent work in Nigeria to emphasize this. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'll move more quickly. So this here is a map of Nigeria. The light area is what is known as southern Nigeria, and the area in stripe is northern Nigeria. And then obviously the work of missions began on the coast, okay, and then they moved north, okay. But then what we find is that as missions moved in, okay, there's kind of this barrier here, okay. We call places north of this thick dashed line, okay, we call the restricted zones, okay. Basically, the story here is that these areas, okay, not just these areas and areas south of it, okay, they belong to they were part of the Sokoto and the Borno Islamic Emirates, okay, and in order to preserve their way of life, so to speak, the British colonial government banned restricted missions from expanding to those areas, and then the solution, I guess, was that the government primarily took over the provision of schooling in those places. So our one aspect of our study is to look at places, okay, surrounding this zone, okay, basically 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, and look at, first of all, the probability of missions locating, okay, just outside and just within, okay, these lines. Okay, so these areas are all in northern Nigeria. So we basically ignore areas in the south, okay. And then so that's one. And then secondly, use that to study. So basically, so this takes care of our identification problem, okay, because these areas, these lines are kind of, I mean, these borders are, so the western border is bordered by, so the Niger flows like this, so it goes like this, okay. There's a highland here, like a plateau, okay. There's a plateau here, and then there's another river that flows down here. So it's basically rivers, a highland, and then rivers, okay. So in a sense, it's not a, okay. So it's a real boundary, but it's not a cultural boundary or a social boundary, at least at the time these provinces were established, okay. And so I've kind of told this story, so I'll skip. I can answer some questions. So in terms of what we're finding in areas outside the borders, okay, they were more likely to have missions compared to areas within. And I mean, you can see that. And then we also see that in areas outside the boundary, okay, schooling attainment is much higher than areas within, okay. So we don't use the full sample. We only use locations just right around the border, okay. And then obviously we check, okay, that there are the only difference in terms of colonial infrastructure, okay, in areas within and outside the border is in terms of mission stations, okay. We don't see the big differences in terms of railways, motorways, hospitals, presence of a city. There were no seaports in these areas, so it's zero. Okay, so these areas have no cities, okay, no, in terms of big cities, no seaports, okay, barely any townships, okay, and then there were some government schools, okay, but they did not differ in places within and outside the restricted areas. The main difference is in missions, and then we will show balance for some other variables, okay. So these investments were, as at the time, okay, the mission stations were established. And basically, the only difference we found was that places within the restricted areas tended to be at slightly higher, okay, higher elevation, and then obviously they experience less rainfall, okay. So that's kind of the two main main differences. And I'll just show you a table quickly, but I mean, you guessed it. Okay, the presence of a mission just around that border. Okay, having a mission station is strongly correlated. Okay, with educational outcomes today. Okay, and then this is the first stage of the regression. Places within the restricted provinces, okay, are less likely to have mission stations. Okay, and we solve this identification problem because we know that the restriction was externally imposed and not due to internal demand, so to speak. Okay, so we look at places within 10 kilometers, within 20 kilometers, and within 30 kilometers, and the findings are quite consistent. Okay, and so and then in terms of mechanisms, okay, we explore differences in the impact of missions by initial conditions. Okay, we look at the presence of government schools. Okay, we look at differences depending on whether you're in northern Nigeria or southern Nigeria. Okay, so in a sense, places in southern Nigeria are better because they are more connected to trade. Okay, then we look at places that were not urban and places that were in urban areas, no high population density, low population density, places close to railways, places farther away from railways, places that are centralized, okay, in terms of indigenous institutions, and places that were not centralized. But I think the big differences we see, okay, are in places with government schools and in places with railways. Okay, so basically what we're finding here is that in the best locations, okay, the marginal impact of missions is actually not different from zero. Okay, so the impact of missions are not found, or the impacts are not really found in the best locations. Okay, the impacts are found in places that did not have government schools. Okay, and in places without railways, where you might think are the worst places. Okay, so these are places where on the margin, okay, the presence of missions made a big difference. Okay, so basically, I mean, another way of saying this is that in places without government schools, okay, or places without government schools, the supply of schools, okay, brought about by missions, okay, made basically all the difference, okay, in terms of. But then in places with government schools, in places where government, if we look at only areas where government supplied schools, okay, there is really, I mean, the marginal effect of missions the marginal effect is close to, it's not distinguishable from zero. Okay, and yeah. So and then we look at heterogeneity in terms of crop suitability, proximity to coals, okay, petroleum deposits. Okay, we don't find in terms of we don't find that the impact of missions. We don't find that the impact is larger. Okay, in what you might think are the best locations. Okay. In terms of plans, so why you might think are the best locations. So, I mean, I don't know how much time I have. I can easily skip this.
So you've got about 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, so I can quickly. Okay, thanks. So and then in ongoing work. Okay, we're building on the study by Wanchekon et al. In Benin, to look at the history, okay, and the effects of the earliest missions and schools in different places in different areas of Nigeria. So we study 20. The study covers 20 out of the 36 states in Nigeria, and we cover every possible zone. Okay, deserts, okay, Muslim areas, Christian areas, places with more egalitarian societies, places that were less egalitarian, okay, places where the location was connected to trade and places where the location was not, okay, in isolated places. So we think that, so there are two things. This will help us solve some identification problems, but then it will also help us explain more about the mechanisms. Okay, what exactly is it about missions? Okay, that's related to education that leads. So that leads to this long run social change. Okay, so to speak. So we look at schooling. We look at household wealth. We look at networks. Okay, in terms of social networks beyond the local community. We look at civic responsibilities, political participation, okay, and so on and so forth. And then importantly, I think for us, we also interview people in these communities in terms of what they remember, okay, from their parents or their grandparents on the arrival of missions, okay, how well missions were accepted, okay, and how missions expanded. I mean, I think this is I think it's important to capture these stories because it will help us understand better what's in terms of what is going on. Anyway, so the study is this way. Okay, we in each area we will look at the first school. Okay, it could be a mission school or a government school. Okay, basically what we find is that in places within the restricted zone I showed you earlier, all the first schools were government schools, okay, and they were located in the what you might call the central city, okay, because the government was more concerned about anyway, they were located in the central cities. But then in most all other places, okay, the first school was the mission school, and then the government school came much later. Okay, so we look at the first school and the first three cohorts, okay, and then we're basically able to identify from school records, from interviews and whatnot, the first people in the community to attend those schools, okay, and then so we call them the T1s, okay, and then we within the same community, okay, we also identify people who of the same cohort, okay, but did not go to school. So these are what we call T2 type 1s, okay, people in the same village, okay, but they did not go to school, okay, and then we also identify people within neighboring villages. So we say within 7 kilometers, okay, of the same cohort, but then they did not go to school. These we call T2 type 2, and then the control group are individuals, okay, be between 7 to 20 kilometers of the first school, okay. So again, same cohort, but basically I guess our assumption is that beyond 7 kilometers, okay, people did not have access to these schools, okay, and then we restrict it to 20 kilometers so that these communities are somewhat comparable, okay. So one difference is that in the study from the Cape Colony, okay, there's really no possibility of people leaving their village and migrating to the village with the mission, because of the way these societies were, okay. The mission station in the village or in the community, members of the community often saw it as their own thing, so to speak. So I thought that was anyway. So then we have the first generation, and then we also have the second generation. This includes nieces, okay, their children, and then okay, so we collect data on schooling, wealth, attitudes, okay, connections, their achievements, and so on for the first generation, and then the second generation, which includes children, nephews, and nieces. So I'll just quickly, just in the interest of time, the primary comparisons, okay, are between the T1s, okay, those who went to school, those who did not go but lived close to them and knew them, those who did not go lived close to them but did not know the T1s, and then the control groups. So the assumption here is that the first subjects, okay, did not attend school based on their future outcomes or their position in the community. I mean, so we don't strict with this assumption is not strict, because we know in some of the first schools, especially government schools, they were built for the sons of chiefs. Okay, so in that case, we know that they wanted to build these schools for the sons of chiefs. But what we're trying to do is to compare the impacts there, okay, to the impact in places where basically the selection was more random, okay, to get an idea of what's driving this persistence. Okay, and then the first or the second assumption, which is actually first here, is that communities within 20 kilometers, okay, would have been just as likely to receive the school. Okay, and then, but again, we don't. It's not a strict assumption, because we also have places where we know the school was placed there for a reason, okay? And then we would also like to see whether the impacts there are different from places where we know that they were more random. For example, in one place, the school was placed, but then the missionary, okay, got some lady pregnant. So the school the school had to close down and move to a different village. So so we can compare that situation to places where we know the school was built there for a specific reason, to serve a specific purpose. So I mean, so we have these assumptions, but we also, I mean, we take advantage of the heterogeneity in the data, okay, to do more. Unfortunately, the work is ongoing, okay, but I'll present quick results from 5 states, okay. So for the very earliest schools, okay, the locations were as good as random, okay. Many people did not fully understand the value of education or what missions were trying to provide. So one story you hear consistently is, oh, we regret, okay, not sending our kids to school when missions came, okay. So they will point to some neighbor that sent their children. You know, most people in the village thought they were, you know, they didn't know what they were doing. But then once those people went to school, you know, graduated, got jobs, and it did spur for the demand, okay. So that initial supply was crucial, okay. And then in places where there was no school, okay, they just didn't have the opportunity to even enroll to begin with. But obviously, as demand expanded, okay, schools opened in some cases, okay, in neighboring communities. Okay, so I think this last line is wrong. Okay, schools actually expanded faster in places where the government was not primarily responsible. In fact, the government in Nigeria, the colonial government, was very slow in building primary schools, I think. So in places where the government was not primarily responsible. Anyway, so the result we find is that for the first generation that attended school, just as we expect, okay, they have better education outcomes. They are more likely to have some education. Okay, at least people that were identified as going to the first school were more likely to have some education. And obviously, in terms of years of education, roughly what you might expect for someone who finished primary school. Okay, so not the case for all the rest. Okay, so and then we will also find the same in terms of they spoke more languages, probably English and the local language. Okay, they spoke more national Nigerian languages. Okay, they were much less likely to believe in traditional religion or to practice traditional religions, which is the effect of missions, and are more likely to practice some Abrahamic religions. Okay, so one thing I would like to mention that this is all schools. Okay, this is mission schools and also government schools. Okay, we're finding these effects. All right, and then when we find that these people, the earliest students also had expanded social networks, I mean, just outside the local community, and then they were more successful in terms of as reflected in household wealth. But I think the point I would like to make here is that even though there was that initial supply shock, okay, in the second generation, so this is actually the effects on the children of the first generation. We see that their children also continue to do better. Okay, so we interpret this. Okay, so this is compared to their nephews and nieces and people in the same community. Okay, whose parents did not go. Okay, so we interpret this as saying that demand is also is also important. People who the direct descendants, okay, of those who first went to school, okay, within the same community, okay, are also more likely, or we're also more likely to have more education, okay, compared to their neighbors, okay, within the same community whose parents did not go. Okay, so I guess let me refer to it. Given, okay, that initially, okay, these people were roughly similar. Okay, they lived in the same communities. Okay, everyone they were all farmers and whatnot. So we take this as evidence that the initial success of the T1s, okay, led to greater aspirations for their descendants. Anyway, so that's one implication of that finding. And then another implication, I mean, I already said this, is that the sustained effects of missions can be partly explained by the absence of basic government investments in education. Again, we find that in places with government schools, okay, the marginal effect of missions is relatively on education is relatively close to to zero. But then the last result I showed you also shows that control on supply, okay, demand also plays a role in persistence. But then I can discuss some more about whether this is demand or selection, okay. Obviously, if a family is more likely to be educated, then you find that it goes on within the same family. And then I think, at least from what we're doing, that there are some areas of future work, okay, some understanding of the absence of missions from some areas, okay. Was it the case that basically missions did not go to some areas because they had no access, okay? Was it because of hostility of the local community, okay, or was it driven by colonial policy? In the Nigerian case, we highlight, okay, absence driven by colonial policy, but it's also the case. It's possible in some places that the local communities were hostile to missions, okay. But then I think it's also important to tease out whether were they hostile to missions, were they hostile to Christianity, were they hostile to schooling per se, okay? If non-Christian missions provided schools, okay, would they have gone, or were they generally hostile to outsiders? And I think that's an issue that has not really been. I mean, there has been some attempts, but it's not consistently done. And then I think there's also some areas of this. I mean, we're doing this in Nigeria, but I think there's also potential to do it more broadly, trying to look at how schooling infrastructure spread, okay, from the first schools to neighboring communities, okay, and the speed of this spread and what was driving it, okay, and what was driving it. I think the study by Yadwaba et al. They look at the spread in Ghana, and they find that the spread could be explained by what you might call demand factors. Okay, what you might call the demand factors. But then from our study in Nigeria, you go to places in Nigeria where basically these are rural isolated communities, okay? But you go to every community has a school or a mission school, okay? So there's really no railway, okay, no profitable crop, no businesses, okay, there's nothing that would have predicted that missions would be successful in this place. So what led to that spread? I think that's something that could that could be important. So I think I've already discussed this, and then I think I've said this earlier. I'll kind of repeat it again. Basically, I focus on education, but missions affected much more than human capital. Okay, changing African religions, okay, is really fundamentally changing the way people live. Okay, what they believe, what they thought is important, or kind of the glue that holds society. Society together. So I think there's some potential to look at the impact of missions on pre-colonial institutions and beliefs. Okay, polygamy is one that has been studied, but there are some other aspects. Inheritance rules. Okay, who inherits what? Okay, how it's done, how societies are organized and whatnot. In terms of governance, in terms of conflicts, in terms of fertility preferences, okay. So there's some potential to also look at the impact of colonial era missions and in these areas. And then lastly, and not the least, it will also be how missions interacted or interact with colonial administrators. Okay, was it in places where they cooperated? Okay, where are the impacts stronger? Where are they weaker? Okay, or so what's going on there? And then in places where in many places as well, missionaries were also traders. Okay, missionaries were also traders instead of, so they in places where they had to fund themselves. Okay, they were missionaries and they were also traders. Okay, what is the cooperation between, what was the cooperation between missions and traders? Okay, was it positive? Okay, or was it negative? What are the broader impact? So I mean, so I think I'll stop there for now. Okay, to leave more time for questions and discussions. But I think fundamentally that there are still open questions around exactly what roles missions played. Okay, what did missions do exactly? That has led to persistence. Okay, it's still open. Okay, but I think one evidence emerging from our work in Nigeria is that the role of missions in filling gaps in human capital in investments. Okay, that the role they played is important. Okay, but I mean, Africa is a big continent, so these so stories might be different in some other places. So more work is needed in this area. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dozy. That was really illuminating for certainly for those who know little about the field, but also for those who have read some of these missionary papers. I think it's you've touched on many things that I think some of us have thought about and I've not been brave enough to mention in the work that we've done, but certainly they require more attention. So I will open the floor now for a couple of questions. We don't have a lot of time, but let's take 2 or 3 questions. If there are other pressing questions, we can take those as well. So while we wait, I'll start with one thing that I've just thought about while you were presenting these results on the intergenerational effects, which I think is something certainly we need more of. So that's really interesting, those kind of results. But I was wondering, when you mentioned the effect that you don't find anything for where government schools are, and I'm wondering about this relationship between government schools and missionary schools. So to some extent, my sense would be that actually mission schools trained the teachers that would ultimately work in some of those government schools. So do we have any evidence for that? So, you know, if you that would probably require a lot of kind of archival work to find the names of the students who ultimately end up as teachers. But is there some, you know, positive interactions? Are they complementary to some extent, or are they pure substitutes? I guess that's the question I'll have, and then I'll give over to others. Perhaps we can take actually then a couple of questions. So I see 3 hands, so let's go with those 3 questions. I hope your paper is long enough, Dozy, to write down all these questions. So let's first go with Lee Gardner, and then with Anton Ehlers, and then Jonathan Schutz.
Thank you. Yeah, this is fascinating. I had a bit of an unstable internet connection, so if I ask something that's been talked about, just tell me. Sorry about that. So I had 2 thoughts. One was a bit more of a comment based on some of your last slides. So in Liberia, which I've been working on recently, there's a very, very thin line between missionaries and merchants in some areas. So they actually get tax incentives or tax kind of incentives because what they're doing is supposedly good work. And there's lots of kind of court cases and controversy about the idea they're using these incentives to actually just be merchants and not really be. So I think exploring this sort of mercantile or kind of the extent to which they kind of expanded networks of markets for imported goods into new areas may be quite interesting, quite worthwhile. My question, though, is it's a little bit of an unfair question since all the work you've done has been based on Nigeria, but how much do you think is sort of Nigeria specific? In particular, the kind of there's a particular attitude among sort of colonial officials in Nigeria that's kind of resistant to education, right? It's coming from Lugard and all the rest of this. And I'm wondering how much the slowness in establishing schools is sort of specific to that, and whether that would extend to other countries, or sort of how much there's kind of individual character to administrations in different colonies.
Cool. Anton?
Yes, Dozy, just a question about missionaries. It seems to me that we're using this generic term of missionaries and we're throwing all the missionaries into one pot without making a distinction between them. And I just want to ask, if you think about the South African situation, there were a wide number of different missionary groups. Okay, the London Missionary Society, the Moravians, the Berlin Missionary Society. Is it possible that there could have been a difference between the various impacts because of what those specific missionary societies brought to their mission. Some of them might have had different approaches to things like education or health, or they might have had different resources, financial or manpower or anything else, and that might have affected the impact that they could have had. Is there any way that one can differentiate between those long-term impacts of the different missionary societies? Because what we are doing now, if they're Christian missionary societies, we're just throwing them into one pot and we're trying to measure that. Or is that not something that should concerns one?
Thanks, Anton. And then let's take Jonathan as well, and then I'll give Dozie the chance to respond.
Great, thank you so much. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. So I wanted to ask if you could perhaps speak a little bit more, if you have any thoughts about specifically the difference between mission schools and Islamic schooling. And the reason I'm thinking about that is, you mentioned at the end, okay, is this human capital investment? And I'm thinking, the difference between the kinds of skills you might get in education generally, literacy, numeracy, analytical skills, maybe even the social networks, compared to the particular kind of cultural, either conversion or syncretization that would happen at both mission and government schools, and the long-term impacts of that. And I'm thinking specifically about a shift from Islamic training that might link you to a larger kind of economic world of Islamic networks, compared to a shift towards kind of Christian and then kind of European American kind of global networks. And yeah, what difference do you see effectively between what's going on in Islamic education in the long run and mission education, and what does that mean for human capital investment versus other possible mechanisms? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll try as much as possible. I think on the first question on government schools versus mission schools. So we're not saying that missions didn't do anything in places with government schools. What we're saying, I think what we're trying to say is that at least over 100 years, okay, places with government schools tend to look alike. Okay, so if you take places with government schools with missions and no missions, in terms of educational outcomes anyway, they tend to basically look similar. Okay, so it's definitely possible that nearby missions trained people who ended up teaching in government schools, but then in some other cases as well, so government schools were better financed. Okay, so they could afford to hire teachers from different places. So it's definitely possible. For example, the government school program in northern Nigeria was designed by a missionary. Okay, but he's designed the program to basically remove religion from the curriculum. So I think my statement kind of would kind of underplay what missions actually did. But I think what I'm trying to say is 100 years down the line, okay, these places tend to look the same. But then yes, missions also played important roles in the development of education in general, including government schools. So in a sense, it's at least in ex-British colonies, it's almost as if the colonial government left education to missions and decided to focus on other things, which might explain what we find. So the comment on Liberia and missionaries as merchants I think it's also the same in many parts of West Africa, and it's partly driven by the fact that some of these missionaries had to pay their own way, so to speak. They had to finance themselves which is why I also mentioned that it's a bit unfair to characterize all mission investments as colonial as colonial investments, because the communities themselves also finance these things. So I think more credit has to be given there. And then our results specific to Nigeria, I don't believe so, because the policies we examined was actually first implemented in the Sudan, okay, and then adapted to Nigeria. And then also it was similar in northern Ghana. So it's a policy that was, I think, one way to read it is that the foreign powers used missions to hold their places on the continent. And then when they arrived, they decided to, okay, job well done. Okay, we'll take it from here. That's kind of how I read it. So they tried to discourage. At some point, they became from being pro-mission to anti-mission. Not just in Nigeria, but in northern Ghana, and I think in some parts of Uganda as well, because they felt, that the areas could be better governed without missionary interference. So I wouldn't say it's specific to Nigeria, but I think the scale at which it was implemented in Nigeria was quite I think it was on a large scale. And then are there differences by missions? The answer is yes. So there are lots of differences, and I think that's for some reason I missed this. Understanding these heterogeneous effects of different missions, okay, is actually very, very important. I mean, there are studies that look at Catholic missions versus Protestant missions, and they find some differences, okay. But then they find that where missions had to compete, okay, amongst themselves, these differences kind of went away. In Nigeria, for example, again, I'll go back to Nigeria, where there are lots of CMS, the Christian Missionary Society from London, CMS missions and Catholic missions. In other parts of Africa, where Catholic missions were not, they did not face competition. They didn't provide as much schooling as Protestant missions. But in Nigeria, at some point, Catholic missions provided more education than Protestant missions. So it's kind of, and I think so. It's not just differences by missions, also differences by missions and what was happening in the local context. And then there are studies that look at missions that provided the printing press. For example, they found that those missions have different long-term effects on civic attitudes compared to missions that did not. And some other authors have also looked at missions that provided healthcare and missions that did not. So there's some work in this area, but I think one thing I would say is that the data is still kind of from the top down, okay? There's still some work to be done in digging deeper into what these missions actually did and whether their activities, okay, in terms of being traders, in terms of being administrators, in terms of being the different roles they played and differences in long-term impacts. And then I'm not an expert on Islamic schools, okay, but I'll kind of, I think the lecture is titled Perspective, so I'll provide my own perspective on the issue. But I think there was probably a point in history where Islamic education was quite prestigious, okay? It was important for learning and advancement in society and social mobility. And at the time that missions arrived, okay, the Islamic power was kind of waning, okay? At least in West Africa, the Islamic Emirates, they saw what happened in the Sudan, they saw what happened in Egypt, okay? They saw what happened with the Ottoman defeat and whatnot. So they could see the tide changing, okay? And what they did in northern Nigeria in particular was elementary school was in missions, was in Islamic schools, okay? And then after that, they moved to mission schools, okay? After not missions, they moved to government schools. Sorry. So in these places, Islamic schools continue to play a role, okay? And I think at the very basic level, what they did was they went in, they memorized the Quran, and then if you wanted to move on to become an imam or a teacher, then you go through the different stages. But in northern Nigeria, most of the leaders, okay, actually sent their kids to Western schools, okay. They went to Islamic schools, okay, until, I don't know, they completed the first, I'm trying to find the right word, but the first cycle where they learned to read the Quran, and then they moved to government schools. And because, I think they understood that this was important, so to speak. So, and then, but I think my perspective is that the failure of the government, so the missions were not able to come in, which is a reasonable policy, okay, in an Islamic society. But at the same time, the government failed to establish enough schools, okay? So what it meant was that Islamic education kind of expanded, okay? And it expanded in a way that was, how would I say this, in an unstandardized way, okay? So in an unstandardized way. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there is some scope, okay, for integrating Islamic education with Western education, and that was explored, okay, and implemented in some areas, okay, especially in places where governments build schools. But in other areas, this was just not the case. And I think one criticism of at least Islamic education as it was back then was that it just didn't prepare students, okay, for an economy that was changing. Okay, so from looking east, okay, the economy was beginning to look south towards the ocean, and Islamic education just didn't prepare students for this change. The leaders of the Emirates, they recognized this change, in many cases actually tried to lobby for more schools, but the government was quite reluctant to provide them. Yes.
Dozie, thanks so much for those answers and for stimulating so many new ideas, certainly for me, but I'm sure also for many in the audience. All is left that is left for me to do is to say thank you. I'll get to the speaker last, I think, because that was certainly the most important part of tonight's event. But let me just very briefly say something about LEAP, the research unit that hosts the annual LEAP lecture. LEAP is a research unit at Stellenbosch University that is dedicated to promoting economic history and quantitative history. It's an interdisciplinary unit. We've got a lot of postdocs and PhD students in the Department of Economics and also in the Department of History, and also links to other departments. So I'm happy to see that there are some political scientists on this call. There are some theologians, some archivists as well. So I really appreciate your time to join us this evening. We fund, as I've said, PhD students, postdocs, and so I want to congratulate firstly one of my PhD students, Amy Rommelsbacher, who submitted a PhD this week, and another new PhD student, Tim Galande, who proposed his or defended his PhD proposal also this week. So there's a lot of action at the LEAP offices. And also we've just signed on a new postdoc student, Leonie Walters, that will join us next year. So a lot of activity happening. None of this is possible, though, without the support of our HODs. So in economics, it's Andri Skumbi, who's on this call, and I want to thank you for all the support that you give us in the economics department, and also Anton Ehlers, who's joining us here from the Department of History. For your support. And then a final point that I want to make is that a lot of this is possible through funding that we receive from donors. And so I want to acknowledge all of the donors that contribute to LEAP. These are institutions, they are grants that we bid for, but also private individuals that support the work that we do. And I really appreciate all of their support. And they allow us to do the things that we, to fund specifically the students that we support. Lisa, thank you for your kind introduction for Dozie tonight. And then Dozie, I really appreciate you taking the time to prepare for this lecture. I know these preparations take typically much longer than one plan to do. So I know that there's a lot of work that's gone into it. And it's a commitment at a time that I'm sure you've got many other things to do as well. Also, you're expanding family soon, so I want to congratulate you also on that. I'm sure there's a lot of excitement there. It would have been wonderful to host you in Stellenbosch. Of course, the way the world has gone has meant that this is difficult this year. But please know that the invitation is always open for you to visit us. We will, make sure that we will have that dinner at some stage in Stellenbosch, and we look forward to your visit in future. A final invitation is also for me to anyone else that's tuned in that would want to spend some time at Stellenbosch joining us in promoting economic history. Please get in contact, and we'd be happy to find a way to find a place for you for a sabbatical or for a short exchange. With that, thank you, Dozie, again, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it, and good evening.